Welcome to Leading for Literacy, a podcast made for teachers who are passionate about strengthening literacy education in and out of the classroom. In each episode, I delve into the latest research, ask the big questions, and unpack effective and practical evidence-based strategies to support your practice. It's all about making literacy clearer, more effective, and more connected to ultimately support students in becoming confident, creative, and literate individuals. I would like to start today's episode by acknowledging the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording this podcast. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and recognise their deep continuing connection to the land, waters, and community. Today, I will be discussing one of the biggest and ongoing challenges faced within the education system, the literacy gap, specifically for students in rural locations. You may have heard this term being thrown around in education discourse, but what is the literacy gap? In a simplified explanation, it's the degree of disparity in literacy levels between different groups of students. This is influenced by a range of factors that integrate to create the conditions for literacy skill development. Factors may include an individual's gender, Indigenous status, language spoken at home, socioeconomic status, and geographical location, to name a few. The literacy gap is detrimental not only to student educational outcomes, but it also permeates into their life outcomes, inhibiting their capacity to become well-informed, independent, and active members of the community. The rurality or remoteness of an area creates contextual elements that may inhibit a student's development of literacy skill sets due to the availability of resources and access to effective learning experiences. This issue entered my foresight when I recently experienced the rural literacy gap after spending 4 weeks in a rural primary school, where the literacy skills demonstrated by students were significantly lower than the suburban and metropolitan peers. This experience provided me with a newfound awareness of this gap and consequently a passion for closing it. This passion is also reflected in various documents and guiding principles for education, such as within the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the Mbantua Declaration. The development of these goals signifies the degree of effect the underlying issue imposes on individuals. By closing the literacy gap for rural students, individuals are afforded improved life and education outcomes. However, when left unaddressed, these gaps within education actively work against these goals, necessitating specific actions to see the reduction, mitigation, and elimination of these barriers to equitable and just education. It is abundantly clear that more needs to be done through policy and the education system itself, but how can we as classroom teachers work to reduce and mitigate the literacy gap for rural students? According to Kiselter and Cultus, revealing and discussing the factors which contribute to low literacy skills of rural students, teachers can develop informed practical solutions to mitigate these factors. So we need to bring it back and begin by understanding the issue at hand. This requires the careful examination of literacy skills and identification of what factors are affecting them in the specific context that is rural and disadvantaged students. This is such a nuanced area which is indisputably under-researched. However, what research does show is, aside from location, the prominent factors that impose significant implications upon rural student literacy development relate to the school, families, and community contexts. Lamb, Glover, and Wallstab explore a range of these factors and bring attention to a couple of key things: absenteeism, the experience of teachers, and family engagement. The reason I mentioned these specifically is that these areas, I think you're able to make an effort towards changing in your practice today. Hattie explains that teacher quality is the single most important in-school factor influencing student achievement. Your identity as a teacher, your pedagogy, and your practice are things you have complete control over. Philosopher and education reformist John Dewey stated that students need education that prepares them to be literate, informed, and actively engaged citizens capable of navigating and influencing society, texts, and discourse. Therefore, students need high-quality reflective teachers who adapt their practice to meet their unique needs, including the context that influence them. Something, however, that was rather prominent within research is the adoption of a deficit lens and viewing the rural literacy gap from a metropolitan perspective. Despite the challenges that accompany rural students, Comer and Karma explain that you need to move away from deficit lenses to engineer pedagogic redesigns that make a difference. Deficit thinking ignores the necessity of radical policy change and dismisses a sense of urgency aimed at fighting systemic discrimination and hence contributes to the reproduction of structural inequities. Thibault and Kerwood argue that multiliteracies can be used to close the gap between teacher-directed, individual and assessment-driven learning and authentic, shared and purpose-driven learning. It's all good and well to suggest that rural teachers embed more experiences with a wider range of resources, including multimodal texts, but the issue of access and other constraints that the application of these suggestions necessitate for more practical solutions. Reflect on what works and what doesn't for your unique group of students, as new literacy practices require not only a new set of competencies to be taught, but also a different approach to teaching and learning. Another significant factor that impacts rural student literacy development is absenteeism. Students missing out on school is an issue that is present within every school, regardless of the geographical context. However, when analysing the data, the findings of metropolitan and rural schools are exceptionally different. According to ACARA, a child in metropolitan school on average attends 92% of school days each year, equating to approximately 16 days absent. How many days do you think students in rural locations miss each year on average? 20? They actually miss 26 days every year on average. This is 10 more days without access to learning every year compared to students in metro areas, and 182 days, almost 1 year of schooling absent across their entire primary school years. It's quite alarming, isn't it? So how can we work to reduce this number? Developing strong, ongoing, and collaborative relationships with students, parents, and carers is a strategy that is widely recommended within current research to address student absence and literacy outcomes. The values and attitudes held by parents about education and school can shape a child's attitudes, as when parents do not value education and are not involved in their child's schooling, children may adopt similar attitudes, ultimately impacting their decisions around attendance. The influence parents and carers have on student attendance and consequently achievement highlights the necessity for teachers to work to develop strong, respectful, and ongoing relationships with students and their families through adopting a relational educational approach. Amina Barnes and Saito highlight that it is the role of teachers and schools to create a caring and positive learning environment which mirrors students' diverse experiences and identities, ultimately building a sense of belonging. This role, which teachers must embody, improves the student's sense of belonging while building connections with families underpinned by relational education as opposed to a separation paradigm. But how can you do this in a meaningful and effective way to see a real difference? The Department of Education and Training establishes that partnerships are an effective way to support and empower positive parent engagement and bring together family and community resources to enrich student learning well-being. The collaboration paradigm involves explicit, regular, and directive communication between educators and parents, while educators make clear to parents and carers how their active participation in their child's education directly enhances their achievement. You can do this by seeking out meaningful and genuine ways to communicate with parents, demonstrating an innate willingness to involve them in the educational process. This begins by viewing parents as partners in education, as well as the child's first and ongoing educator, who holds valuable knowledge to support the student's development. Recognize the value of the knowledge the family holds, the cultural capital they bring, and how they contribute to the outcomes for their child. Demonstrate this through the continual efforts to foster a strong partnership. However, the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership explains that effective engagement with families must be responsive and adaptable to the family-specific needs and contexts. Therefore, the strategies utilised to increase parents' engagement within the child's learning may change over time, correlating with their needs as well as the needs of the student. Invite regular verbal dialogue, discuss alternative communication methods, and take advantage of digital resources such as ClassDojo, which can open another avenue of communication with parents. This ensures the ongoing collaborative process, but also increases parent investment in the student's learning by making learning visible, providing reflections of student achievement, and inviting feedback. Working to close the gap by creating an open channel of communication while adopting a reflective, strengths-based perspective of the students and their families, considerable change can be reflected within students' attendance, ultimately increasing literacy skills needed for the 21st century. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you found today's episode of Leading for Literacy insightful, equipping you with strategies to embed in practice. If you have any further insights or perhaps found this useful, leave a comment and we can keep this discussion on rural literacy gap going.